The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill, owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. I'm a professor, a scholar, and most importantly, a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books, I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. It's a podcast all about books. Every episode, I sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, and important books. And sometimes we just hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And today, I am incredibly honored to be joined by a wonderful writer, a brilliant historian. He's the author of a wonderful new book. It's called JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. Fredrik Logevall, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
No, the pleasure's mine. I guess I should mention you teach at an institution somewhere in Massachusetts. It's, what is the name? Harvard. Is that what it is?
It is indeed. I have a joint appointment at Harvard. I'm in the Kennedy School of Government. So, and by the way, I should say, since I'm a little defensive about this, I signed the contract to write this biography of JFK before I came to the Kennedy School. So I don't want people to know that think there's some sort of connection there.
Right.
I'm also a joint appointment in the Department of History.
It's quite nice. So I can't wait to talk about this exciting book. But before we do, I love to talk coffee first. And as I was reading this wonderful book, all 800 pages of it, I decided to have a cup of all black La Colombe coffee. I do just a nice medium or dark roast, very simple. Keeps me energized. How about you? You're a writer. You go in the archives. Do you drink coffee?
I live on the stuff. I'm originally from Sweden. And as you may know, it is a coffee culture over there, and we always have it black. And so that's what I do. It's always strong. And I suppose if you said, well, give me one that you like, I think a nice French roast is pretty tough to beat. But I had some this morning. I'll have some after you and I finish. It's just critical, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. One thing I have to say, though, while I was drinking coffee, reading the book, I didn't need the coffee to sustain my interest in the book. It was incredibly interesting. So you've written a book on somebody who people think they know. In your estimation, after all of this research, after all of this writing, who is John F. Kennedy?
I think he is a hugely consequential figure in 20th century American history and indeed in world history. I think he's an important figure. He's, of course, somebody who became an iconic figure. By the way, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. I'm from Sweden, and my little corner of Scandinavia, John F. Kennedy, he was a very important figure to Swedes. And when he was assassinated, Swedes of a certain age can tell you where they were when they found out that he had been killed. So he was this figure, quite unlike anything we've seen. And therefore, I think we need to understand him. And I think he was a serious student of public affairs from an early point. I think he was a flawed individual, no question. Makes him, in my view, more interesting. He was flawed both as a person. He made mistakes in policy terms. But we need to reckon with this person, and that's what I'm trying to do in this book.
I got to say, I walked into the book with some assumptions. I said to myself, what could I possibly learn about JFK? We know everything there is to know about JFK. You know, I mean, we have an idea of who he is as a figure. We know who he is as a kind of American icon. We have a sense of the lore surrounding him. And then I went through and I looked for other biographies of JFK. And I realized there aren't nearly as many as I thought. There's actually a fairly limited number of amount of writing on JFK. I saw a really fascinating biography on his father, Joe. I saw some other things, but not what I expected. Is that what brought you to the book, to the project?
Well, there are surprisingly few what we might call full-scale biographies, and not one, I would say, that really takes advantage, uses the archival materials that are available at the Kennedy Library, which, by the way, are superb, and puts this extraordinary American life into this historical context, which is what I also try to do in this book.
You know, I've read your earlier work, particularly on Vietnam. There's a very different project going on here. There's something very different about being a historian and being a biographer. And some historians have done wonderful jobs. I mean, David Levering Lewis did an amazing job with W.E.B. Du Bois. I've seen it done well. and I've seen it not done as well. What did it mean for you to take off the historian hat, at least a little bit, and put on the biographer hat, or are they different hats?
No, I think they are different hats, and I think you put it well. I don't think it's the same kind of writing. I think I probably, since this is my first biography, I probably missed, at least to a degree, the differences between them. That said, I'm approaching this project as a historian, and I thought when I began, again, talking about this with my editor, and we were chewing over different book ideas, I thought I can bring my historian training, my historian's approach to bear on this biography. Nevertheless, I think you're quite right to say that now I'm writing about a life. It's a contextualized life, but nevertheless, it's a life. And I have to think about the reader. If JFK disappears from the narrative for 5 or 6 pages, is that okay? Will a reader become impatient if young Jack Kennedy is not there every 2 or 3 or 4 pages? That I had to think about. That's not the sort of thing that the sort of thing that a historian ever has to think about. So there's I hope I managed it, but there's a challenge in integrating the biographical dimensions here with the historical.
One of the things that the book does quite nicely, I think, is that it parallels JFK's life, particularly this part of his life, the early parts of his life, with the rise of American empire, with the birth of the American century. In a sense, you're saying as JFK is coming of age, America is coming of age as the hegemon. Why that parallel? There are lots of ways you could have drawn this narrative out. Why that one?
Well, I was walking in Harvard Yard one day. This was early on, so a few years ago. And I thought, maybe the way to do this is to tell basically twin narratives to, how should I put it, map onto Kennedy's life, the rise of Kennedy, map onto that the rise of America, as you say, to great power status, to superpower status. Because it occurred to me, again, of course, that he was born in 1917, just as the United States is entering World War I, hugely consequential moment. And he dies by an assassin's bullet in 1963, which in some ways is kind of the pinnacle of American power. So I thought, maybe there's a way here to use this dual narrative approach and, in a sense, understand both stories better. Not only do we get a better sense of Kennedy, but in fact, through the lens of JFK's life, we can understand better how it is that the United States became this incredible global power during the course of his life. I hope you can put the two of them together in that way.
And you do that. You put them together. Let's start with the Kennedy part, because again, many people feel like they already know him. There are biographies we open up and we want to. I remember reading Robin Kelly's wonderful biography of Thelonious Monk and thinking, okay, now I know much more about Thelonious Monk than when I started, because I didn't go in with any expectation. I knew who Thelonious Monk was. But from popular culture, from movies, from, again, all the kind of books and biographies and analyses of particular moments connected to JFK, I feel like I know him. Americans feel like they know him. Did you feel a compulsion to say, look, I gotta dig up some stuff here that Americans don't know?
Yeah, I would be lying to you, I guess, if I said, I felt nothing like that. I probably did feel a need to do that. But I also said to myself and to my wife and others, it's less important for me here to have new stuff, new revelations, than to tell this story well. And I felt, Mark, that the early Kennedy hadn't really been told. There's a quite marvelous book by Nigel Hamilton, which was going to be a 3-volume biography, but Hamilton decided to stop after the first volume, and that was a really useful book, but nevertheless, it wasn't quite where I was going. And I suggest in the preface to the book that all of us, human beings, or let's say almost all of us, are really shaped by our teens and our 20s. It isn't to say that we're a completed individual by the time we hit 30 or in our early 30s, but we're substantially shaped by those earlier years. If that's true, then I think we need to pay a lot of attention to Kennedy at that point. He serves in World War II. His father is ambassador to Britain, which is a very important part of this story for me. And I didn't feel that totally fascinating story, in my view, had really been fully told, and I could tell it here.
Wow. Well, you definitely begin to tell it. Again, just so people know, this is the first of 2 volumes. And again, you begin with in 1917. You take us to 1956, 4 years before he would assume the presidency. But you begin with a kind of understanding of Kennedy as someone who had a very particular set of political preoccupations and a very particular vision of what the United States' role should be in the world, which I thought was interesting, particularly given his father's politics. So maybe we should start there. Who was John F. Kennedy in relation to his parents or his father in particular in his politics? And how did that play out into who he became?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. He's very much his father's son. His mother is also important in his upbringing. Rose Kennedy often doesn't get the attention that I think she should get as the matriarch. 9 children, let us remember. But there's no question that Joe Kennedy, the father, is the principal figure in young Jack Kennedy's life. And what's fascinating to me is the kind of divergence that occurs in or about 1939-40. Jack is an undergraduate at Harvard. His father is ambassador to Britain. He is an arch appeaser. He supports Neville Chamberlain's efforts to prevent the war. After the war begins, he is adamant that the United States should stay out of the war. This is none of our business, etc. And little by little, Jack separates himself from his father. He begins to see that intervention is probably imperative for the United States. Certainly helping the Allies is imperative. And one of the things that I think is interesting, which I talk about in the book, is that Joe Jr., who's the older brother and is the golden child in this family, Joe Jr. is never willing to separate himself from his father. He parrots his father's position right to the end. He's killed in the war in 1944, and then Jack becomes the heir apparent. But Jack shows, I think there's compelling evidence for this, shows this willingness to take a very different position on the great issue of the day, which is, should the United States intervene in the war? What should be the American sort of posture in the world? And I think he holds to that view fundamentally through the end of his life in Dallas in November 1963. That is to say that the United States needs to have a leadership position in the world. It needs to work with allies, but nevertheless, it needs to be that leader, and his father never accepts that position. That's a difference between them that never goes away.
You hit on something that I think many people don't understand about John F. Kennedy, that I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but I would imagine that it shapes how he navigates the world and how he navigates various moments of his political life. And that is that in some ways, he was like the replacement child, in the sense that, again, Junior was the one who was beloved. Even in the book, I was struck by it. There's a moment where they get IQ tests, and Jax is higher, and yet the mom doesn't believe it. They're like, no, he has to be the smart one. He has to be the talented one. There was an expectation that he was being groomed for the greatness that the Kennedy family could produce, not John F. Kennedy, which I think, again, when we look at him through the lens of 63, right before he dies, he's this striking, handsome, smart, articulate political leader and a generational figure. It's like, how could you not see that coming, right? It's like choosing Tito Jackson over Michael Jackson. You know, it's like how could this possibly happen? And yet it does. Is it just because he was the namesake? How did Jack Kennedy not get the love that his brother did?
It's such a good question, and I think, I too, like you, I want to resist too much psychoanalyzing. I'm not trained in that, for one thing. I think there are a few things. He is the firstborn. He is the namesake of his father. He is Hollywood handsome. I mean, he is straight from Central Casting, Joe Jr., if you've seen photographs. He's very ambitious. He's aggressive to a fault, I would say. But there's nothing that's going to stand in his way. And his parents have built him up all those years. He was a kind of surrogate father when Joe Sr. was away, which he was a lot. Joe Jr. stepped in. And so maybe on some level, it's quite natural that the parents would have this idea. Nevertheless, as you also say, it's pretty clear if you look at their prep school papers, if you look at their undergraduate papers, if you look at the letters that they wrote, that there's an imaginative intelligence that Jack has that Joe Jr. does not have. And other people, by the way, who interacted with both brothers thought from a pretty early point, so 1940, 41, 42, during the war, no, Jack is the one who has something special. And the parents either didn't want to see it, maybe some part of them did see it and they just didn't want to admit it, but they never shook that idea that Joe Jr., he's the one destined for greatness.
And that idea of sort of resisting the idea that Jack was special, to me, in many ways, is a twin narrative with this idea that he was a late bloomer, that he somehow came into his greatness or the possibilities of his greatness much later than we imagined, that there were no signs of precociousness or talent prior to sort of maybe the late stages of Harvard. It seems to be an idea that we have, which almost understates how extraordinary he was throughout his life.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I suggest, it's a kind of theme in the book. He was actually not really a late bloomer. I don't deny for a moment that he loved to have a good time, that he was especially interested in girls, and there was that side of his life which we can discuss. But I'm struck by the fact that to some extent in prep school, even at Choate, but certainly at Harvard, he's already deeply interested in, for example, democracy. Can democracy survive in the current environment of the late 1930s? And he asks questions, by the way, as an undergraduate that seem, I think, resonant today about democracy and the challenges of democracy. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but in one of his papers, unless democracy can produce able leaders, its future is in peril. And so he's interested in this from an early point. He publishes his senior thesis as a book. Not many undergraduates do that at age 23. It becomes a kind of minor bestseller. And we could say that Joe Kennedy Sr. helped in terms of the sales. But really, this was a book that stood on its own. And so, yeah, I think there is a seriousness to this guy from an early point. He treated, as I put it, serious things seriously. And we should make note of that.
No, absolutely. Talk to me about John F. Kennedy at Harvard. His days at Harvard, in some ways, were sharply contrasted to his father's days at Harvard, where the gentleman C, I think you mentioned, was entirely reasonable and acceptable. You talked about the different Harvards that were there, that there were different communities, different ways you could be at Harvard, from working class to the athlete to the socialite to the politically connected, etc. Joe Kennedy goes to Harvard largely through miracle, divine intervention, it almost looked like, based on his schooling records. John F. Kennedy enters as the son of a power broker, or a son of a powerful family, at least, and a very different kind of set of possibilities and opportunities in front of him. Who is he at Harvard?
He is somebody who still faces, at least to a degree, the kind of prejudice that his father faced, to a lesser degree. That is to say, yes, Irish Catholic is not going to be acceptable to the top final clubs. Final clubs at Harvard were and are elite sort of universities within the university, or entities within the university. And so Jack faced some of the same kinds of discriminations that his father faced, but it was a different time, as I think you're suggesting. And he was able, by the time you get into the late 1930s, to make his way in a way that I think his older brother even couldn't just 2 years before, partly because of personality. Jack was just more charming. He had a better social antenna, social intelligence than his brother, but certainly as compared to his father. And so by the time he becomes, I would say, a junior, and certainly by his senior year, after he has this extraordinary excursion through Europe right before the war, he's a serious student, more serious than he had been maybe in the first 2 years, becomes kind of obsessively interested in this senior thesis that he's going to write, is actually made a member of a final club. So you can see there how things have changed. That would not have happened in Joe Sr.'s day, that an Irish Catholic would be tapped. But still, some of those prejudices, some of those closed doors, and I think it breeds in JFK a certain detachment that we see that's characteristic of him later on, where he wants to observe rather than always be a full participant.
He wants to observe rather than be a full participant. And yet, post-college, he embarks on an incredibly quick political rise. He wants to get into the fray. He wants to get into the mix of civic life. He wants to be part of this democracy in a very significant fashion. Does he always want to be a politician? What's his vision for this?
Well, there's a suggestion in some books that it's only after Joe Jr. is killed in 1944 in a kind of mindless, ridiculous operation over the coast of England, a kind of suicide run, really. He's killed, And some people say, oh, it's after that Joe Sr. says, Jack, it's your turn. You're going to do this now. I think I showed that, in fact, he's thinking about politics already at least as early as 1942. So this is a couple of years after leaving Harvard, graduating. It's the year before he serves in combat in the South Pacific. Already then he's telling a girlfriend of his, Inga Arvad, a Danish girlfriend, they're talking about him running for office. And so I think he's interested in this from an early point. His grandfather, we haven't mentioned, Honey Fitzgerald on his
yes.
other side, notable sort of legendary Boston politician. I think he was partly inspired by his example. So I think it develops over time. I think he flirts with the idea of journalism. He flirts with the idea of academia. There are other career options for him. And it's interesting to speculate. Suppose Joe Jr. had not been killed, had returned from the war alive. Would the JFK that we know, would Jack Kennedy and nevertheless ultimately have become a politician? We can't know the answer to that. But I would say he had his own reasons for running. It wasn't just his father's pushing him.
Absolutely. I love when I get historians to engage these kind of historic counterfactuals. It takes them out of their comfort zone.
And you know what? Let me just tell you right there that I do a lot with counterfactuals in my classes here. And I have some colleagues, and I love them, but some colleagues who say, what's the point? We have enough difficulty, Fred, explaining what did happen in history. Why should we waste our time on what might have happened? What I say to them and what I say to the students, au contraire, we can learn a lot by thinking about unrealized alternatives, by thinking about the avenues that could have been taken. It adds to our understanding.
No, absolutely. I live on those things. So he goes into politics. We know for certain that he has a passion for it. Certainly he has a gift for it. We'll never know what would have happened had his brother survived. But what we do know is that he had his own vision for what his political life would look like. He's elected to the House of Representatives at 1946. Is that right?
Correct.
And has a successful 3 terms before going to the U.S. Senate. Those campaigns were not examples of, daddy pays the bills and directs traffic and just gets me to the end zone, right? I mean, this is a case of someone who had their own political vision and their own idea of how to get there. I think that's another thing that people don't appreciate about JFK, because again, I saw him as almost like if Donald Trump Jr. were to run, in 2 years, I would imagine what that would look like. If, the children of dynasties who kind of walk in, or God forbid, if a politician passes away and their spouse kind of slides into the seat, I sort of see it as a kind of pro forma thing. This was a real campaign, a real vision, and a real set of strategies that diverged from those of his father, no?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And there are people, respected authors, who will say, oh, daddy bought him his house seat, or, it's all about daddy's money. I won't deny that, he was better funded than his opponents when he ran for the Democratic nomination in 1946. By the way, the nomination battle was all that mattered. Once you win the Democratic nomination, it's all over. So it was that one that mattered. But what we see there, he's this skinny, emaciated 29-year-old running for the House. And what you see is his work ethic. You see that he's willing to go all day and into the night. And this is not his dad. He's having to do this. We have these buildings all over Boston, the triple deckers. He is scaling these triple deckers, night after night, talking to voters. So you see that willingness to work hard. You see that he articulates, as I think you were suggesting, a vision quite different from his father's, which is a kind of capacious, idealistic vision of what he thinks America, or at least in this case, the 11th district in Massachusetts, should be about and what he should be about. And it proves, I think, over time, and when he runs for the Senate, he hones it further, a winning message, which is about public service. It's about democracy. It is about the obligations that we have to those who are less fortunate. I wouldn't say he's particularly liberal. He's kind of a centrist Democrat. But it's a powerful vision that this young JFK articulates and that he then carries with him really to the end of his life.
Who is JFK in terms of his human relationships? Obviously, people go to the tawdry stuff, which is sort of the easy place to go. But I'm actually more interested, although I have a little interest in the tawdry stuff, I'm more interested in sort of who he is as a connector, who he is as part of a community. Who was he as a friend? Oftentimes when you read these biographies, you come to find out that people were cutthroat, disloyal, that they loved humanity but hated humans, that kind of thing. He was different in a few of those ways. Can you talk a little bit about who JFK was at the interpersonal level?
I think there was a certain emotional reserve. He got this at least in part from his mother. He was not a backslapper. He was not in some ways all that sociable. Maybe that's the wrong word, but that's the one I'll use. There was a certain reserve. He was actually quite shy in some ways. And you wonder, therefore, how he became a successful politician. But that was kind of hard early on because he had this shyness. What he showed, however, was deep loyalty to his male friends. I wish I could say the same about the female friends, but I don't think he showed that as much. But to his male friends from college, from the Navy, he was very loyal and they were loyal to him. There's lots of examples of this that I show in the book of that loyalty. And this is getting ahead of ourselves, but I think ultimately, and some of this will be in volume 2, even the problems in the marriage with Jackie, to some extent, I think they were able to at least work through some of those. And that is in part because he came to recognize what he had in her and how important she was to him. It wasn't as evident early, but that's a little snapshot, I hope, of the personality, if you will.
No, I think that's important. You went exactly where I kind of hoped you'd go, which is partly those gender distinctions and how he navigated the world. Again, the private life of JFK is probably the thing we know most about. What makes that stand out, I think, is the time period. We know lots about Bill Clinton. We know lots about Donald Trump. I don't know if there's more to know about Obama or whoever comes after, but there's something about in 1960 and soon after having this much information on him that sort of positions him as an outlier in terms of everything from philandering to, all the kind of stuff that happens in order for a politician to be successful. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, he gets positioned as exceptional in that way, and he may not be.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. And I realize that I can't have it both ways. If I'm going to say on the one hand, which I do, that he was his own man, he was his own master when it came to politics and to career choices and to world philosophy, what he wanted to do in terms of his life. He was not under his father's control. If I'm going to make that argument on those issues, I can't very well say, well, he just learned from his father, and his father was his father was a philanderer. He sometimes brought mistresses home to the dinner table, if you can imagine. Yeah. And of course, both Joe Jr. and Jack learned from the father. And by the way, he also made very clear to Joe Sr., I expect the two of you to carry on in the way that I do. Basically, you're seeing women as objects to be conquered, but I can't very well say, well, that's the explanation, or it's the Mad Men age or whatever, because lots of men were not that way. And if he can break free from his father on other issues, he should be able to break free on this. So I think this is a problem. I will say that I don't think that the womanizing, which begins early and is chronic, and he cheats on Jackie, he cheats on her before the wedding and he cheats on her after. I don't think it's predatory in a certain way. And in volume 2, when he's in a position of real power, he's president of the United States, I think that shifts. But this is an unsavory part of his persona from an early point. It's pretty clear, though he finds women interesting. He finds it interesting that the way they think, the way they reason. Inga Arvad, who was in some ways the great love of his life, he loved her in part because she was so intelligent. She was so knowledgeable about the world. She spoke many languages. It's also in part what attracted him to Jackie. So it's a complicated view of women. He certainly objectified women in a way that I think is deeply regrettable.
Who is Jackie Kennedy to him?
I think Jackie was somebody who he admired and respected. He could not get over the fact he was terrible with foreign languages. And the fact that Jackie had fluent French and she had excellent Spanish and also German was something that he thought was just incredible. He sensed that she had more style than he had. He became more stylish.
Right.
Yes. And she, by the way, had very important, he became a natty dresser, and he came to have an interest in clothing and in furniture and in all kinds of things because of her. I think they shared a similar sense of humor. Both were really humorous. Conan O'Brien, in a marvelous essay, O'Brien says that we've had two funny presidents in our history, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. truly funny presidents. And I think he's right about that. We haven't talked about his self-deprecating sense of humor. He had it, and I think he was attracted to Jackie because she had the same kind of sense of humor. There's an absurdist quality to the humor that I think they shared. All of that said, he did not treat her very well in the early years of their marriage. And I think she suffered a lot. Some of that comes out in my first volume. Some of that will come out, obviously, in the next one. But I think he always respected her and her intelligence greatly.
The American century, this idea that America would seize control of global power, that at the level of military, at the level of economy, at the level of culture even, that the United States would emerge as a superpower and maybe ultimately the power, at certainly at various moments, the singular power, is one, again, as we talked about earlier, that kind of parallels this rise of JFK. Why is it important for us to chart that? It seems to me that it's not just an interesting chronological coincidence, but that there might be some interesting developments that are emerging on both sides to make this a story worth telling. Talk to me about why it was a story worth telling.
I think it's the case that understanding how it is that the United States came to occupy this singular position, by many measures, the greatest power in the world in military terms and economic terms, basically smack dab in the middle of the century. That's an important historical story. And of course, historians have been, and other scholars have been engaged in telling that story. I don't mean to say that I'm the first, but what I think is interesting, I hope I pull this off, readers will have to tell me, is I think one can better understand that rise, how it is that the U.S. came to occupy this position. Greater, I think, by many measures, by the way, much greater than even the Soviet position. In some ways, we have really one superpower in 1945, not two. But we better understand it by looking at the Kennedys, by exploring, for example, this schism between father and son that we discussed earlier. Because there's this debate, as you know, before Pearl Harbor, between isolationists, so-called isolationists, and interventionists. If we look at that through the lens of the Kennedys, I think we understand it better. I think World War II and JFK's service in the Pacific helps us understand how the United States becomes this colossus. Early Cold War, where he's a Cold Warrior and his father is not. McCarthyism, we haven't talked about that. The family is close to McCarthy. And so what we sometimes call the Second Red Scare, this kind of domestic, ferocious anti-communism, I think we understand that better through the lens of JFK. And by the way, a particular thing there, JFK, who's savvy, he's a shrewd politician from an early point. I think he understands, and I write about this, that the smart political position in the United States, if you're running for office or if you're running for re-election, is to be to the right of your opponent. That is to say, to be hawkish on the Cold War is the smart position to take. He takes it. So those are some examples of where I think telling these two stories together helps us better understand both. It helps us better understand Kennedy, but also America.
That's incredibly powerful. Talk to me about your process a little bit with regard to this book. There's no shortage of archives and records. And recently, we've seen the declassification of more stuff with regard to Kennedy in particular. What's the journey like to go from book idea with the editor to producing this book with regard to getting these archives, getting records, figuring out how to piece together these stories, these letters, these incredible letters? How do you get all this stuff?
It's a really great question, and I love talking about process. And we historians and biographers, we probably all have certain similarities, and then we do certain things differently. For me, it was about spending a lot of time at the Kennedy Library, which is just down the street. I can get on the Red Line in Harvard Square, and at the other end, take a little shuttle bus, and there I am at this marvelous facility. So it's about immersion in these sources, which, as you say, are great. Little by little, a picture begins to emerge. And I can then outline, I can do a kind of rough table of contents. I can begin to outline individual chapters, fold it into all of this. And this is where historians and biographers will sometimes differ among themselves, is the secondary sources, the existing books and articles. I'm one of those, as I get older, as I get deeper into my career, I tend to I tend to jumble it all together. So I'm reading books. I'm seeing what, Bob Dallek said in his biography, and I see what David Nassau, you mentioned the biography of Joe Kennedy Sr. I look at what they're doing even as I go. In the past, I was basically trained in graduate school to do the archival work first, do some writing, and then maybe look at the secondary sources. Final piece, which I think is really important, two quick things. One is the Kennedy Library has a marvelous oral history project. And so I made heavy use of, these were interviews that were done, many of them right after the assassination. So you have to use them carefully because, of course, people are distraught at that moment in time, but nevertheless, they're really valuable. And then newspapers, Mark. Newspapers, I tell my students, are an underutilized source by historians. So to go back and see what both major papers, say the New York Times, and more regional papers or overseas papers, what they had to say about the issues, that I fold in as well. And little by little, a book emerges, you begin to draft chapters, and then eventually you have a book.
One of the things that comes up in your work quite naturally is the use of letters. And when I read many interesting biographies, I was reading a biography of written by Imani Perry on Lorraine Hansberry. And there are these fascinating letters between Baldwin and her. I think about, I just read Eddie Glaude's new book, Begin Again, on Baldwin. And he's writing fabulous letters to all sorts of interesting figures. Manny Marable's book, on Malcolm X, they're writing letters. Malcolm's writing letters from Mecca to anyone who, would listen to certain parts of this moment he was in, politically and spiritually, et cetera. And I think about what the next century will look like for historians, because we don't do that.
No.
Are we losing a vital source of insight, or is there another kind of unit of analysis that we'll draw on that will allow us to write these kinds of books for the next generation of great figures?
It is such a good point. I am acutely worried about this. Not so much for me, but my graduate students and the graduate students that come after them, or people who don't go to graduate school, but who are going to write history. I think you're so right about this. We are losing, probably have begun to lose already, a hugely valuable resource. And it's not just, I think you make a very important point here. It's not just government documents that are a concern to me. A bigger concern is frankly what you discussed, which is letters. People writing to one another. I've been married a pretty good long while now. My wife and I in the attic have boxes of letters that we wrote to each other that are there. I'm not sure anybody will open them. Maybe our kids or grandkids at some point will open them. But the point is, we were writing letters. I relied heavily in this book on the letters that the Kennedy family in particular wrote to one another. I wouldn't have been able to write the book, certainly not the same book without it. So this is a real problem. I think even for me, if I may, one more thing, even for me in volume 2, I wonder if this is going to be a problem. And what I mean by that is the young Jack Kennedy, teenager, guy in his 20s, wrote all kinds of letters, and they're wonderful. As he becomes more prominent, and then as he begins to run for president, we see fewer letters. And maybe that's common among all politicians, or many of them, is that they begin to, maybe they take more care, or they don't have time. Maybe there's no need. So I think I have lots of sources, more sources than I need, frankly, for volume 2. But the letters, especially from him, there won't be as many.
And that terrifies me. I'm an anthropologist, and so I think much more about sort of, I was thinking the age of COVID, what happens if we can't travel anymore, right? Like, what's lost if, all of my participant observation is through Skype or Zoom, right? It could be a disciplinary crisis. I don't know if letter writing amounts to the level of disciplinary crisis, but if we lose kind of spaces of engagement, or, suddenly Twitter and text messages become the spaces that we now can kind of replace the letter, I think we lose something really valuable in terms of intimacy, in terms of the kind of performative dimensions of those technologies versus others. I just don't know what's at stake. And honestly, I'm not a historian or a biographer, but it genuinely scares me.
Oh, yeah. No, and you've just put it so well. I would concur with everything you've just said. And it's even possible that it's not just about, let's say, if we're talking about history for a moment, and let's limit it to presidents for a moment, which is a small slice of history. But just for simplicity's sake, it's not just about let's say the Obama years and the Trump years. I'm hearing from colleagues who are investigating the early part of this century. So, they're looking at Bush, or they're talking maybe even further back, the Clinton years, maybe even the Reagan years, that you're not seeing the same kinds of source materials. Or certainly this is true, let's say, if we go from 2000 forward. And it scares me too. And I worry about it. And I think it's probably a progression or a regression, meaning we see fewer and fewer materials for, say, Bush 43, and then still less for Obama, and even less now. This is a real problem. I don't know what the solution is.
Well, the next time you come on with your new book, you'll also have the solution to this this epistemological crisis
from your lips, Mark.
Talk to me about your actual writing process. Do you write every day?
I do. When I'm working hard on the book, I try to write every day. Now, as you know yourself, this is to some extent dependent on, does one have a sabbatical for part of this? Is one teaching a heavier load one semester than a different semester? Is it a new class that requires more prep? Lots of things, as you know, can enter into this. But I think it's really important for me, maybe not for others, to try to write every day, especially a big book like this. And I try. I don't always succeed. In fact, maybe most of the time I don't, but I think it's helpful to have a kind of benchmark. So I often say, I want to get 1,000 words down today on paper. I may revise them. Some of them will end up in the trash bin, so to speak. But at least if I get words on the page, I say this to my students as well, because they say, Professor, I'm looking at this blank screen and I've got to start writing. And I say, just do it. Start writing, and then you can revise. But I have a good day if I'm feeling pretty satisfied with 1,000 words, 800 words, whatever. And one of the things that I've learned, I don't know if you do this, but somebody said to me, in fact, I think a few people have said this, when you get to whatever that number is, stop.
Yes.
And I think, wait, I'm on a roll. Why should I stop? But there's actually something to what they say, because if you stop at, say, it's 700 words or 1,000 words, whatever it is, then the next day, if you're midstream, it's actually a good thing because you can keep going. So I'm trying to stop rather than keep going.
That's great advice. There's a wonderful book out there for anyone listening. It's by Paul Sylvia. It's called How to Write a Lot. It's exactly what it sounds like. But that's one of his arguments is you set appointments, you write over a block of time. And when you hit that moment, whether it's the 2-hour mark or the 1,000 word mark, whatever it is, you stop and you wake up the next day with the same momentum and energy to keep going. And I have done everything I can to follow that rule. And I can't say that I do it well, because when I have the energy, I just keep going. Because I'm not convinced that I'll have this great idea by the morning, no matter how many notes I take. Let me ask you about deleting, because you write large sections of text which diverge from maybe the central theme, but are central to us understanding the book, right? So you'll tell us an entire, like you may devote 10 pages to giving us the backstory of what's happening in Ireland, right? And so I may learn about potato famines more than I ever thought I would need to know, but it's instructive for understanding the Kennedy family. Do you ever find yourself writing stuff where you say, you know what, I probably don't need this, but it's already on the page and I can't delete? And I'll give you a quick example. I wrote, when I wrote Nobody, which is a book I wrote in 2016 about what was going on in Ferguson, there was a moment in the first chapter where I spent, and I'm not a historian, but I spent like weeks studying about the World's Fair and learning about sort of architecture and housing to figure out how St. Louis became St. Louis. And before I knew it, I had written maybe 25 pages on the World's Fair and housing in St. Louis. And my editor was like, you do not need more than 4 pages of this. But it became a 2-week battle because I was like, I wrote this and I really did a lot of work to find this. And there's no other place that I'll ever need this, right? It's not like I can save this for my next book, which won't be on this at all. And so I found myself struggling not to go too in the weeds. But once I write, I find it very difficult to delete. Now, I'm not a very good judge of that. I mean, when you're writing 2 800-word biographies. I mean, at some point you have to say, hey, enough, right? Delete, backspace, don't go. I mean, how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's hard. I think cutting one's own prose is just like pulling teeth, at least I find. And when I've written something, let's say it's 3 or 4 paragraphs having to do with, I don't know, JFK's naval training before he went off to war. And my editor says, yeah, you know what? I don't think we need this. Or maybe I myself will begin to wonder, do we really need this? Because that is an important thing that authors should always ask themselves. Almost every paragraph. How does this relate to my broader purposes? And if I don't have a good answer to it, it may not belong. But even when I ask myself that question, so I have some doubt, it's just hard to cut. I think I've gotten a little bit better as my career has advanced at both avoiding the problem by knowing up front, I don't actually need 12 pages on the World's Fair or 12 or 4 pages on this part of the naval training. So I think this is less of a problem for me now than it used to be. And I'm more conscious of the need to sometimes slow the narrative down, sometimes speed it up. I think that's an important part of writing, is to get the pacing right. But nevertheless, even now, and this happened with JFK, it was not a hugely longer book, but it's about 650 pages of texts in the finished product, about 800 total, as you said, but
with the
about
notes,
650 text. Probably another 50 pages there that at some point ended up on the cutting room floor. There's no easy way to do it. No easy way.
So you just have a file, you just have a Word file somewhere with 50 pages of random info.
Oh, and if it's something, I'm not sure I ever do this, but I say to my students, save it in a file, and then you can produce an article on it, or you can do some other piece. You can come back to it. I don't know that I ever do it, but at least I do save the stuff that I cut.
Okay.
With rare exceptions. Obviously, if it's a few sentences, then I'll just cut them. But if I have a little section, a discrete section on something, you never know. I put it in a folder, and then maybe at some point I'll come back to it.
Well, that's great advice for all the writers out there and the aspiring historians. Keep a file, save the stuff you don't delete, or rather that you don't use. But it's better to have stuff on the cutting room floor than to have a book with too much stuff in it, because the book reviewers will remind you of why that was a bad idea.
They totally.
Let me ask, who do you read? I mean, obviously as a historian, you try to read in your area and in your field and subfield. But help me think about biographies, though. I mean, are there biographers or biographies that you love to read?
I try, and for maybe obvious reasons, lately I've been trying to read to see what biographers of political leaders do, how they approach this. A Harvard historian who I never got a chance to meet because I arrived after he had retired is David Donald, who wrote, I think, a quite marvelous biography of Lincoln. And so That was one that I read not too long ago. Of course, one has to read Robert Caro. And even though Caro on LBJ is a different kind of beast, it's going to be, when he finishes, it'll be 5 volumes. And it's a longer life, but nevertheless, as you know from Caro, it is in depth. Nevertheless, we can all learn from Bob Caro. And so he's somebody I've been reading of late. Jean Lacouture, a French journalist, I guess, has a 2-volume biography of de Gaulle that I thought was really helpful to me, again, in thinking about how to make choices as a biographer.
Yeah.
How to look at the public de Gaulle, and then also make some room for the private de Gaulle, the marital relationship, and so forth. Those are 3 that come to mind that I've been thinking about, and I will go back to. But there's just so much, as you know. I mean, you're a book lover yourself. There's just so much out there to read, and it's marvelous.
Yeah, no, it's a good problem to have that we'll never read everything that's on our list or that we'd love to read. You're going to write a biography of someone else in the future. I'm predicting this. Who will it be? After you're done these marvelous volumes on JFK, who's the figure you think deserves this type of scrutiny, this type of analysis?
I actually don't know. I've begun to think about that a little bit. I do think that your prediction may well be true, and that is because I have found biography really pretty enjoyable and satisfying intellectually. And I think this model that I'm following, or this approach that I'm taking, which is to contextualize, to tell, in a sense, twin narratives, as I put it, is one that I've really enjoyed. It's been challenging, but I like that. But the subject, Mark, that's an interesting one. I do think, I've thought long, it's the same era. It's a little too close, frankly. But I've long been fascinated by Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and then Johnson. And I've written a lot about McNamara as a Secretary of Defense, as one of the architects of the Vietnam War. He's also a very emotional person. And if you ever saw McNamara in action, you'd think the opposite. This is a number cruncher. This is a sort of bureaucrat par excellence. There's a very different McNamara underneath that veneer. But a couple of other people are now working on McNamara. I don't think I would be doing it in any case. But that's an example of somebody who was close to power. In fact, was at the top level of power. And yet I think has been misunderstood. Among other things, he had these early doubts about the Vietnam War, even while he's a champion of escalation under Johnson, even while he's an architect of this disastrous military adventure. Privately, he's saying, I don't think we can do this. I don't think that we can win. And that's a really interesting, sobering story to be able to tell. But it's I think for somebody else.
Someone will definitely tell that story. I worry sometimes that in the age of like sort of market logic, that too often publishing houses will only take the story of the JFKs and the Robert Kennedys and we don't get the sort of interesting, nuanced analyses of people who may not be the sexy subject, but they may be the ones who give us some insight into the moment, that particular historical moment.
I think it's so true. You know, I did an event earlier this week with George Packer, and he was the host. So we talked about JFK and he asked questions, but we also talked a little bit about his biography of Richard Holbrooke.
Right. And that's a great example.
It's a good example. And, you know, George is a very distinguished author, and maybe somebody else would not have gotten a contract for what turned out to be, I think, a really illuminating biography. But nevertheless, I think you're quite right. We need those books as much or more as we need the books of our political or cultural leaders. No question.
Okay, so it's time to play a game that tortures my guests but brings me great pleasure. It's called Buy It, Borrow It, or Burn It. I will name 3 books. One you can buy, one you can borrow, the other gets burned. And of course, this is all in the metaphorical sense. We wouldn't burn any books. We love all books. But this is the game that we have to pick. Okay, the first book is Lincoln Reconsidered by David Herbert Donald. The second book is A Nation Under Our Feet by Stephen Hahn. And the third book is The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand. So we got 3 books, I believe all Pulitzer Prize winners. You can buy one, borrow one, and burn one.
Oh, man. All right, so here's what I would do. I would buy the Hahn book because it's long been on my list, on my to-read list, and has not been read.
Fair.
I would borrow David Donald, formerly of my department, because it's a very important book that I've read, but I've lost a little track of it in terms of Lincoln Reconsidered and what we can gain from it. So I would want to go back to it, but I'll borrow it rather than buy it. And Menand's book, I would burn only because it's the one of the 3 that I know the best, that I have on my shelf. In fact, I dare say it's probably behind me as we speak. So if it's possible to praise a book to the sky, because it's a marvelous sort of group biography, we could talk about it, that you're then going to burn, that would be the one I'd choose.
Okay, that's fair. That's a bit of a cheat. He's essentially saying, I have the book essentially memorized, so he'll walk through the world like Socrates doing.
This is why your guests hate this particular game. You love, but that was agony. Oh my goodness!
It's pure agony. For the record, I would have because what I've found now is that the audience and my guests have asked me to make the same choices. Which is a lot less fun, by the way. I totally like it when it's no fun when the rabbit has the gun, right? But I will say, I would have bought The Metaphysical Club. For me, there are a few better writers out there to me than Menand. And The Metaphysical Club tells the story of such an important moment in American intellectual history as we think about American pragmatism and how central it is, not just to American philosophy. I don't want to go down the nerd rabbit hole with this, but it's a fabulous book that tells a story of a very formative moment, both at Harvard, but also in our American intellectual history and the history of American philosophy, and what we could call the evasion of what they call epistemology-centered philosophy. I mean, it's a very fascinating book. I would borrow A Nation Under Our Feet. And the subtitle of that book, for those that don't know, is Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration. I knew Stephen. I was a graduate student at Penn when that book came out. It was the first time I saw a professor. I was like, you can get a Pulitzer Prize as an academic? So for me, it was like a window into the idea that you could write a book that people would actually read. And it also was the first time I realized that historians seem to have the market cornered on those types of awards. I mean, when I look at people from, Heather Ann Thompson to Stephen Hahn and hopefully you very soon with this book, there's a way to, you don't see anthropologists, sociologists win these prizes nearly as often, and probably for good reason. I think it has to do with our ability to write clear and accessible prose. And then Lincoln Reconsidered, I Would Burn, despite the fact that it is an extraordinary book. The reason I would choose that is because there are so many books on Lincoln that I feel like if we lost a book on Lincoln, even a marvelous, wonderful, field-changing intervention like that, I feel like we could sleep okay.
See, the fact that you're a veteran of this game, I can just tell, makes it really unfair, because what a great point to conclude with. I'm not going to revise my list. That would be really cheating. But I will say to you, that last point, we have nothing like the Metaphysical Club.
Right.
Or, we have, obviously, it has spawned its own literature and lots of other important books, but it's marvelous. They all are. But I think you bested me in this game. No question.
I never saw it as a competitive thing, but I will claim victory. And you, sir, can claim victory for writing really an important book, probably the most important book written on JFK to date. Thank you for hanging out with us. We can't wait for you to come back when the second volume comes out. When will that be?
Well, don't hold me to this, but I'm hopeful that perhaps in 3 years you'll have me back. I will need some sabbatical time if Harvard is listening to make this happen. But I would love to come back on whenever it is. How about that?
That sounds like a plan. And people in the meantime want to find you. Are you on social media at all?
I am that rare creature who is not on social media, but I am easily findable at Harvard, obviously on the website. And the book is by Random House, so that the book is easy to find.
Sounds like a plan. Again, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Coffee and Books. Make sure you follow us on Instagram with the handle Coffee and Books Show. Also, you can buy all the books that have been discussed here on bookshop.org/Uncle Bobby's, or you can go to unclebobbies.com. That's UncleBobbies.com.